Hello everyone and welcome back to The Lost Planeswalker. You are here with me, Jesse, the Lost Planeswalker, and today we are covering my Atraxa +1/+1 counters deck. Now my first Atraxa deck went up and it was all about poison counters and all the cool cards you could add for that, and now I'm creating a deck that is covering +1/+1 counters, which is probably an even stronger way to play this deck because there are so many creatures that get so powerful and can do so many things with the more counters you put on them. So just so everybody knows, Atraxa Praetor's Voice is green, white, blue, and black legendary creature Angel Horror with flying, vigilance, death touch, and lifelink. At the beginning of your end step, proliferate. A very simple keyword, but can be extremely powerful, especially in a deck like this. So starting off as always, the land base of this deck, I'm going to leave that up to you guys. I got forests, islands, plains, swamps, and the only really land I would super suggest to put in here is Rogue's Passage. Obviously, your tri-lands and your dual lands are going to go in here because you want to play them untapped, but that's up to you if you can afford those, or if you have those, great. If you don't, search what you got. But I'm not going to waste everybody's time by going through all that. So the first set of cards that I'm going to go through are cards that place +1/+1 counters because that's what we want to be proliferating. So we need all those cards that place them to begin with. So starting out, we have Andruil, Nasir Reforged, Arwen Weaver of Hope, and Cathar's Crusade. Our first legendary artifact equipment comes from the new Lord of the Rings box. Has Ascend. If you control 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. Whenever equipped creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. If you have the City's Blessing, put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature you control instead. Not only is this a cool way to buff up your board, but it seems pretty easy to do as well. You're probably going to have 10 permanents by the time you equip an attack with this, so that's very, very cool. Arwen Weaver of Hope is one of my favorite 3-drops from the Lord of the Rings set. It says each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of an additional +1/+1 counters on it equal to Arwen Weaver of Hope's toughness. So if you can buff her up, every creature that enters is going to be similarly as powerful when it enters. And Cathar's Crusade is an enchantment that says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, which can get out of hand if you are making a ton of tokens. Next up, we have Champion of Lamholt, Court of Garenberg, and Crystalline Crawler. Champion of Lamholt is one of my favorite creatures because it says creatures with power less than Champion of Lamholt's power can't block creatures you control. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Champion of Lamholt, meaning that at some point your board is just going to be so huge and big, and no one can stop you from just swinging in and basically one-shotting them. Court of Garenberg is an awesome card from the Wilds of Eldraine that says when Court of Garenberg enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. At the beginning of your upkeep, distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among 2 target creatures. Then, if you're the monarch, double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. This seems like an incredibly powerful card, especially because you're going to have a giant board of creatures, so this is going to be awesome to do. And Crystalline Crawler, an artifact creature construct with Converge. Crystalline Crawler enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each color of mana spent to cast it. So, potentially, you can have 4 +1/+1 enter with it. You can remove a +1/+1 counter from it to add 1 mana of any color, and then put a +1/+1 counter on it by tapping it. With all of our counter placing, we can just basically turn counters into mana and really go all out very, very easily. Next up, we have Danny Pink, Defiler of Vigor, and Fathom Mage. Danny Pink says Mentor, which says whenever this creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature with lesser power. Creatures you control have, whenever 1 or more counters are put on this creature, for the first time each turn, draw a card. This is a really cool card from the Doctor Who Commander decks that's going to turn all of our counter placing into card draw. It didn't need to get stronger, but it did. Next is Defiler of Vigor, one of the awesome cards from Dominaria United. It is a 6/6 with Trample. As an additional cost to cast green permanent spells, you can basically just pay 2 life instead of a green, kind of turning some of your green stuff into Phyrexian mana, and then whenever you cast a green permanent spell, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. And one of my favorite cards ever printed from the wonderful world of Ravnica, we have Fathom Mage, with this really cool evolve mechanic that says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, if that creature has greater power or toughness than this creature, you can put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And then whenever a +1/+1 counter is put on Fathom Mage, you can draw a card. So there's a lot of really cool ways, some ways in this deck to remove counters, so you can just keep casting creatures and putting counters on Fathom Mage and her get bigger and bigger. Next up, we have Forgotten Ancient, Incubation Druid, and Loyal Guardian. Forgotten Ancient is an elemental that says whenever a player casts a spell, you may put a +1/+1 counter on it, similarly to Mana Gorge or Hydra. Then at the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of +1/+1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures, which which is a very, very cool ability that can help us spread the love. Incubation Druid is just a 2 mana elf druid that says tap to add 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce, and if it has a +1/+1 counter on it, add 3 mana instead. So it has this adaptability that lets us put counters on it, but we have so many other things that do that it's going to be very easy to put a counter on this and just get 3 mana right away. And Loyal Guardian is a Rhino with Trample and this really sweet Lieutenant ability that matters if your commander's on the battlefield. So at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control your commander, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Very cool effects. You can see there's a ton of effects that just put +1/+1 counters on everything, just bringing our whole board up as fast as possible. Next up, we have Mana Gorger Hydra, Master Biomancer, and Shalai, Voice of Plenty. Mana Gorger Hydra is simple, it has trample, and then whenever a player casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Master Biomancer says each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters on it equal to Master Biomancer's power and as a mutant in addition to its other types. This is a great way for us to just buff up our entire board whenever we play stuff as well. Very, very similar to Arwen. And then Shalai says, flying, you, planeswalkers you control, and other creatures you control have hexproof, making it harder for us to target some of our creatures. And for 6 mana, we can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. Our next 3 cards are Simic Ascendancy, Sovereign, Okanek Ahu, and Sword of Truth and Justice. Simic Ascendancy is one of the best win cards in any +1/+1 counter deck, along with you being able to place +1/+1 counters for 1 green and a blue. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, put that many growth counters on Simic Ascendancy. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Simic Ascendancy has 20 or more growth counters on it, you win the game. Sovereigner is a legendary creature cat noble from the latest set at time of recording, Lost Caverns of Ixalan. It has Ward 2, and whenever Sovereigner attacks, for each other creature you control with power greater than that creature's base power, put a number of +1/+1 counters on that creature equal to the difference. Meaning that if they have 2 +1/+1 counters on them, they just double that, and every turn we're basically another double effect that is just going to get out of hand extremely fast. And Sword of Truth and Justice, one of the best +1/+1 counters proliferate cards because it gives a creature +2/+2 and has protection from white and blue. And whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, then we proliferate. Looking at the last 2 cards in this first category, we have the Great Henge and Tribute to the World Tree. The Great Henge is a very expensive card, but costs X less, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, which will mean we often cast this for just 2 green mana. And then the turn we play it, we can just tap it for 2 green mana and gain 2 life. Then, whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. It's card draw, it's +1/+1 counters, it's life gain, it generates mana. There's no wonder this card is a $50 plus card, even though it's been reprinted several times in the last year alone. And not as strong, but a very, very good card nonetheless, is Tribute to the World Tree. It's an enchantment that says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card if it has power 3 or greater. Otherwise, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. It does everything we want to do, and I added it to the deck for that reason. Now, before we talk about the next set of cards that modify or do something about the counters that we place on our creatures, I just want to say, if you aren't subscribed to my channel, please do so. This week, I'm going to be putting out an Atraxa video on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. 3 different builds of Atraxa. She's an awesome commander, and she's one of my best videos I've ever done, so I wanted to do more videos to show people different ways to build her. So if you like that and want to see that, please consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean so much to me. Now, let's look at those cards that care about the counters replacing or could modify them in some way. So first off, we have Abzan Falconeer, Branching Evolution, and Bred for the Hunt. Abzan Falconer says each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has flying and has this cool Outlast ability that just lets it put a counter on it itself. So that is awesome. It's going to give all of our stuff evasion. Branching Evolution says if 1 or more +1/+1 counters we put on a creature, twice that many +1/+1 counters are put on that creature instead. That is awesome for us as well. We're just going to be basically proliferating again anytime we would proliferate or place counters or do whatever. And then Bred for the Hunt says whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. Yet another way to get more cards in hand by using the counters that we already have. Next up, we have Conclave Mentor, Corpsejack Menace, and Deep Glow Skate. Conclave Mentor says if one or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, that many +1 are put on that creature instead. Then whenever Conclave Mentor dies, you gain life equal to its power, which would be a great card to have and just bump up and bump up and bump up, and then whenever somebody kills it, we just get a whole bunch of life gain from it. And Corpjack's Menace is probably my favorite fungus card ever printed. If one or more +1/+1 counters will be put on a creature you control, twice that many are put on it instead. There's a lot of cards that do this, but there's not a lot of creatures that do this, so it's just nice to get those because this can be reanimated. It can be, put into your graveyard and taken back out, if it dies. So I really, really love that. And Deep Glow Skate is a fish that says when it enters, we can double the number of each kind of counter on any number of target permanents, which seems extremely, extremely powerful. It's good in Planeswalker decks. It's good in +1/+1 counter decks. It's good in just a random assortment of counter decks. So I love Deep Glow Skate. And our next 3 cards are Doubling Season, Esper Sentinel, and Evolution Sage. Doubling Season is one of the best cards ever printed for counters and creature tokens because if an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many instead. And if an effect would put 1 or more counters on a permanent you control, it puts twice those many on that permanent instead. So it's just a no-brainer that it gets added to this deck. Now, Esper Sentinel is a secretly extremely good card in this case because normally when you have Esper Sentinel, it's just good generically in most decks. But sometimes people will pay the 1 because power is usually only 1. But in this deck, we're going to definitely power that. So whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, we get to draw a card unless they pay X, where X is power. And in this case, X might be 10, and no way anybody's paying 10. So perfect for this deck. Evolution Sage says landfall. Whenever a land enters battlefield under control, we proliferate, which could be even stronger than our commander if you really built around Evolution Sage, but because we can't guarantee we're going to get her every game, it's not the best way to build this deck. But next up, with some new great cards, we have Yuzuri, Stalker of Spheres, Hardening Scales, and Herald of the Secret Streams. Yuzuri is another great card from All Will Be One, which came out early this year, and it says, when Yuzuri, Stalker of Spheres enters the battlefield, you may pay 3 mana. If you do, proliferate twice. When you proliferate, you draw a card. So every time we proliferate with our commander, we're going to be drawing a card. So at least every turn, we're going to be drawing 2 cards, if not more. Hardening Scales is an enchantment that says if 1 or more counters would be put on a creature you control, put that many +1/+1 counters on it instead. And Herald of the Secret Streams is probably one of those cards you want to hold out until you can kind of kill an opponent. But it says creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it can't be blocked. Seems like a no-brainer to me. Next is Inexorbitant Tide, Inspiring Call, and Kami of Whispering Hopes. Inexorbitant Tide is an enchantment that says whenever you cast a spell, proliferate. Seems pretty broken to me, so that seems very, very good. Inspiring Call is an instant that says draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it, and then those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. We can use this just to refill our hand or protect our board or both, so that's a great, great card. And Kami of Whispered Hopes says if 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a permanent you control, that many +1 counters are put on it instead. And then add X mana of any 1 color where X is Kami of Whispering Hope's power. Another great way to generate a ton of mana. So next up, we have Kodama of the West Tree, Lae'zel, Volkith's Champion, and Ozlith the Shattered Spire. Kodama of the West Tree has Reach, modified creatures you control have Trample, and modified is auras you control. Equipment, auras you control, and counters are all modifications on creatures. And whenever a modified creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Such a great way to basically give our board trample and just get through while also letting us pull a ton of lands out onto the battlefield. Lae'zel says if you would put 1 or more counters on a creature or planeswalker you control, or on yourself, put that many +1 of those kinds of counters on each permanent or player instead. And Ozlith the Shattered Spire says if 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on an artifact or creature you control, that many +1 are put on it instead. And then for 1 and a green, we can tap to put a +1/+1 counter on a target artifact or creature you control, activate only as a sorcery, or if we really, really just need another card, we can cycle it for just 2 mana. Next up, we have Teku Thrall, Inquiry Domus, Tezzeret's Gambit, and the Ozolith. Teku Thrall has flying, and if you would proliferate twice instead, meaning every turn we have this out in our commander, we're just proliferating twice each turn. And then for 1 Phyrexian Blue mana, remove 3 counters among other artifacts, creatures, and/or planeswalkers you control, and put an indestructible counter on Teku Thrall, Inquiry Domus. This might be one of the easiest Domuses to activate because it really only requires you to have 1 mana and at least 4 life. So this is very, very cool. Tezzer's Gambit also has a Phyrexian mana that says draw 2 cards, then proliferate. And the Ozolith, probably the second, if not best card in this deck. Whenever a creature control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those on the Ozolith. And then at the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith had counters on it, you may move all counters from the Ozolith to the target creature. And our last 3 cards in this section is Vorel of the Hull-Clade, Vorinclex Monstrous Raider, and Winding Constrictor. Vorel of the Hull-Clade has a very simple but powerful ability for a green and a blue. We tap it to double the number of each kind of counter on target artifact, creature, or land. It's not all of them, but if we have one creature, we can do this in response to whatever and just create a huge threat or maybe knock out an opponent out of nowhere. Vorinclex Monstrous Raider, also one of the best cards in this deck. It has trample, haste, if one or more counters. If you would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, put twice that many of each kind of those counters on a permanent or player instead. And if an opponent will put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, they put half that many on each kind of counter on that permanent or player instead, rounded down. Meaning if they just put 1 counter on something, they actually get no counters. It's a very, very powerful card. It can really shut down some decks, especially +1/+1 counters deck. I would hate for an opponent to get their hands on, my copy of this, because it would kind of shut down how most of my deck works, but that's how it works, I guess. And then Winding Constrictor is 2 mana and says if 1 or more counters will be placed on an artifact or creature you control, that many counters +1 are placed on that permanent instead. And if you would get 1 or more counters, you get that many counters +1 instead. So another very, very cool card to just help us place more counters or cares about counters being added at all. And finally, we're going to talk about the good stuff in this deck. That's all the things that are going to help us, kind of wrap this deck up. I'm talking about board wipes. I'm talking about counter spells. I'm talking about, stuff to double our mana or ramp us or draw us more cards. So first off, we have Arcane Signet, Chromatic Lantern, and Commander Sphere. Arcane Signet, obviously, this is a killer card in this deck. For 2 mana, we can tap to add basically 4 different types of mana, so it's a really, really good card. Chromatic Lantern, also a great card because it's generic mana. It gives us the ability that land you control have tapped to add 1 mana of any color. We can also tap this to add 1 mana of any color. And Commander Sphere, also great, great, great card in this deck for color fixing. Add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity, then we can sack it to draw a card. Next up, we have Counterspell, Cyclonic Rift, and Damning Verdict. Counterspell is very simple, counters any spell in the stack. Cyclonic Rift, often a win con, especially in a big board deck like this. If we can overload it, we can return all non-land permanents you don't control to their owner's hands. And Damning Verdict is another kind of board wipe win con in this deck because it says destroy all creatures with no counters on them. So if we're the only deck really playing a counters-based strategy, we can kind of just wipe the board and swing out and do whatever we want. Next up, we have Dawn of a New Age, Farewell in Guardian Project. Dawn of a New Age is an enchantment that says as it enters the battlefield with a hope counter on it for each creature you control, then at the beginning of your end step, remove a hope counter from Dawn of a New Age. If you do, draw a card. Then, if Dawn of a New Age has no hope counters on it, sack it and you gain 4 life. Well, basically, because we can proliferate, we can just draw a card every turn for 2 mana, so that seems really, really good. Farewell, obviously one of the best, if not the best white board wipe spells because we can choose 1 or more. We can exile all artifacts, all creatures, all enchantments, or all graveyards, basically at our choice. So very, very powerful and good for us. And Guardian Project says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another card you control or a creature card in your graveyard, you get to draw a card. Very, very cool and good way for you just to fill up your hand every time you cast a creature. Next up, we have Heroic Intervention, Kodama's Reach, and Mirari's Wake. Heroic Intervention basically just lets us give all of our permanents hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Kodama's Reach lets us search our land for 2 basic lands. We reveal them, put 1 on the battlefield tapped and the other into our hand. And Mirari's Wake says creatures you control get +1/+1, and whenever we tap a land for mana, we can add 1 mana of any type that land produced. Basically doubling up our mana and letting us cast a ton of stuff. Next up, we have Putrefy, Rampant Growth, and Rhystic Study. Putrefy is just a great removal spell. Lets us destroy target artifact or creature and it can't be regenerated. Rampant Growth, very simple ramp spell. Search for a basic land, put on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. And Rhystic Study says whenever an opponent casts a spell, we get to draw a card unless they pay 1. Next, we have some really core cards to most white commander decks, but we have Soul Ring, Swords of Plowshares, and Teferi's Protection. Soul Ring, obviously, in this deck, help us cast more things quicker by tapping down 2 mana. Swords of Plowshares lets us exile a target creature, and its controller gains life equal to its power, which maybe we use to help gain a ton of life if we have a really big creature and we need to gain some life. And Teferi's Protection says until your next turn, your life total can't change, and you gain protection from everything. All permanents you control phase out, and then it gets exiled. And our last card in this deck is the Skull Spore Nexus, one of the new and exciting cards from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And it says this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, similar effect to the Great Henge. But it says whenever one or more non-token creatures you control die, create a green fungus dinosaur creature token with base power and toughness equal to the total power of those creatures. And then for 2 mana, we can tap to double target creature's power until end of turn. This works so well with the Ozolith, because let's say we have a 10/10 that dies, and it had 9 counters on it. We get a 10/10 creature that we can just put those 9 counters onto, and it's basically a new creature with double the power. So the Skull Spore Nexus is going to do a lot of work in this deck, because we're going to make some big creatures, and it's going to be a huge threat. But that is it, and thank you so much for watching. It has really meant a lot, all the attention I've gotten this year, and I really just want to say thank you to everybody. If you have a suggestion or you have your own Atraxa +1/+1 counter deck, please let me know in the comments down below. I would love to see what cards, you thought, oh, they were a waste of time, don't include that card, or, this is totally a great card to add. It would really mean a lot if you would do that. And if you aren't subscribed and, like I said, want to check out the rest of these I do this week, and I'm going to be doing some decks based around the new legends from Murder at Karlov Manor the following week. So, look out for all that. And if you want to stay tuned, please subscribe. It would just help me out so much. And if you could also share this video and leave a like, that would mean the world to me. Today's Skyfall card of the day is Haze Frog. Its breath leaves its prey too drowsy to struggle. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, I'll see you later, Planeswalkers.